Ezra, can you dim the side spotlights? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, faculty, staff. I want to welcome you here. This week was the 26th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. And so we have a very special guest today, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him and get him up here. And this is Captain Randy Norfleet, United States Marine Corps retired. I know Captain Norfleet because he was my officer selection officer at Oklahoma State. And in 1993, he commissioned me as second lieutenant. So it is an honor for me and an honor for all of us to have him here. And I'd like to ask you to give him a warm welcome. Captain Norfleet.
Good morning, and thank you for letting me be here today on this week of remembrance. And we're going to be talking about the Oklahoma City bombing today, where 168 people lost their lives in one terrorist attack because one man was angry and he allowed his anger to turn into hate. And so I am here to remember my friends and to remember and tell the story of those people that lost their lives in that building just about 26 years ago on April the 19th. I remember I've been given this story for a long time, for 26 years now. And I remember the first time it hit me, I was speaking at the Citadel in South Carolina at a college, at my son's college. It was his senior year. And I got up in front of a crowd much like this one here, where everyone was really young, or was not even born when the bombing happened, right? And so we're going to be talking about something that happened probably 10 years before y'all were even born. But what happened, and at the time, as Colonel Shannon was saying, I was a captain in the Marine Corps. I was the officer selection officer in Stillwater, Oklahoma. And my job was to run the, for shorthand way of saying it, the ROTC for the Marine Corps, right? I ran the officer programs for Oklahoma and Kansas at the time for a recruiting station at Oklahoma City. So anyhow, that morning of April the 19th, I had been asked to come to a prayer breakfast in the Marriott Convention Center. And got up early. The breakfast started at 6:30 in the morning, and we were there. The governor was there. A whole bunch of business leaders were there in the Marriott Convention Center. And about 8:30, 8:45, the prayer breakfast ended, and so I got into my truck. I had a black actually it was a Ford Ranger. I drive an F-150 now. But I had a black Ford Ranger at that time. And I got into my black Ford Ranger, and because I lived in Stillwater, I thought, well, let me go by the recruiting station there in the Oklahoma City Federal Building and go see my commanding officer, right? Because y'all need to go see your boss and do some FaceTime and all that kind of thing. So I got in my truck and I drove up to the Oklahoma City Federal Building, right? And I don't know if y'all have been to the National Memorial that they have there now, but on the west side of the memorial, there's a stoplight, right? There's a stoplight and it looks right into the memorial. Well, as I came up to the building, I stopped at that stoplight because the light had turned red. And I looked in front of me, and there was this yellow Ryder truck that was parked in front of the building. And I thought, well, that's kind of unusual because it was a loading zone. And then the next thing I know is a young guy, jumps out of the truck. He's kind of got a military haircut on him. He's got a camouflage or Marpat bottoms on, and he has a t-shirt. But instead of running and going into the building, because I thought he was just a young sergeant coming in that was going to go get a recruiting tour and that kind of thing. And so, but instead, he ran across the street and away from the building, and he left his truck right there in the middle of the loading zone. And I thought, well, how unsatisfactory is that, right? Because I was a Marine, and I was in uniform, and I just thought it looked really poor on that young sergeant that was going to be checking in to just leave his truck sitting in the front of the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Well, anyhow, about that time, the light changed, and so I took my truck, I drove my truck, and I parked right in front of that yellow Ryder van, right? I got out of the truck, and I walked behind my truck and in front of the yellow Ryder van, and I went into the Oklahoma City Federal Building, and it was, you know, a little before 9 o'clock, and when I went into the building, the elevators were open, and I went up to the 6th floor of the Federal Building. And normally, you know, as a Marine, you always want to look good, so I would stop by the head, the restroom, right? The Navy term for a restroom is the head. So I would stop by the head to make sure that my hair was done right, kind of like Bill's, you know. When you're a Marine, you don't have a lot of hair like I do now, but you want to make sure that your uniform's on right, that you don't have anything stuck in your teeth before you go see the commanding officer. So I went by the restroom, got all squared away, and then I went into our operations office, and the first young man that I met was a young sergeant by the name of Benjamin Davis. And Benjamin had just finished college, and he was married, and he just had his wife had just given birth to their first child, and he had applied to become an officer. He wanted to be a second lieutenant, and so he had put in a meritorious commissioning package, and because I was the OSO and I handle those kind of things, he asked me to call headquarters Marine Corps, right? Because this is a day before the internet, and actually it was a day before cell phones hardly. There were cell phones, but we didn't have voicemail at that time. So I just walked a couple of desks over from there, and I sat down in the the OPSO's officer's desk, the operation officer's desk, Captain Guzman. And he was out of the room at the time, and so I called headquarters Marine Corps, and I got a busy signal, right? I know y'all probably have not ever heard of a busy signal, but I got a busy signal. So I hung the phone down, and I looked a couple of desks away to Sergeant Davis, and I said, Sergeant Davis, you know, the phone was busy. Give me 5 minutes. Right, I gotta go, I need 5-10 minutes, I'm gonna go see the commanding officer, right? Because we all have 5 minutes to give, right? Hey, I'll see you at lunch. I'll see you tomorrow. We'll go do something on Saturday, right? Because we always think, especially when we're young, and I was young at that time, that we have time to give. So I got up, I took my stuff away, I picked up my bag and my cover, and I went over a couple of cubicles away into another part of the building, and I sat down and I started talking to Sergeant Tad Snydercourt. And I was looking at him, and then the next thing that happened, I don't know how much y'all know about Oklahoma City bombing, but that yellow Ryder truck had a 5,000-pound fertilizer bomb in it. And that guy that I saw walk across the street was Timothy McVeigh. And he had what I saw him do was I saw him set the timer on that bomb, that I didn't know was in there, and he was running away to his getaway car, and that's what I saw him do. And so, anyhow, the next thing that happened is the Oklahoma City Federal Building had a glass facade on it. And that 5,000-pound bomb went off, and what happened is everyone inside of the building was showered with shrapnel. And what happened to me as I was facing the front of that building is a piece of glass shrapnel came and it lodged in my right eye, filleting my right eye open, right? And then fortunately, I had enough reaction that I threw my left arm in front of my left eye, and I took shrapnel all down my left arm, and that's what saved me from being completely blind. But as it happened, I was right next to the support columns in the Oklahoma City Federal Building. And if you've seen the pictures, you know that after the blast went through the building, it destroyed the support columns in the building. And I happened to be on the one section that was left standing in the building. And so the floors began to collapse. The 9th floor collapsed on top of the 8th floor, collapsed on top of the 7th floor, collapsed on top of the 6th floor. And what happened to me is when those floors hit, and it was just, you know, an arm's length away from me, the impact of that threw me into the west wall of the building, which is probably the column over there. And I went into it face first, and it fractured my skull, and it left me unconscious. Anyhow, I don't know really how long I was unconscious there on the floor, but I woke up and I realized probably 30 minutes later, because what had happened is everything had become deathly quiet. You know, there was no birds chirping, there was no traffic. You could just hear, all you could hear was the fire of the cars that were in the parking lot in front of the Oklahoma City Federal Building that were on fire, and you could hear the roar of the fire of the cars. Anyhow, Sergeant Snydercourt, who was there helping me, was not severely injured, and he saw, as I came up, he saw that I was bleeding profusely and I had a piece of glass stuck in my eye. And so he cleaned off his desk of all the debris and he put me on that desk. And while I was on that desk, I realized that if I stayed there, that I was going to bleed out. And I was in shock, and I really didn't have my senses around me, but I had enough of a survival instinct to get up off of that table. And what had happened is the dust in the building had settled, and someone had gone to the back of the building, and they had been bleeding profusely, and there was this bright red oxygenated blood that was a trail. And all I could see, because I had this glass in my right eye, and I could barely see out of my left because of all the blood and everything, I could just see that blood trail. And I followed the blood trail to the back of the building, and miracle upon all miracles, all of the stairs in the building were intact, and I walked down the 6 flights of stairs, and I got out the back of the building, and right there as I got out of the back of the building, an ambulance was waiting, and I went into the ambulance, and the ambulance took me to the hospital. And so I got to the hospital, and the doctors checked me in, and my blood pressure was 50/0 because of the arteries that I had cut. I cut an artery here on my head, and I cut my ulnar artery here on my wrist, and I was basically bleeding out. And if I had stayed in that building another 5 minutes, I wouldn't be here today. So by that time, when I get into the hospital, I make the nurse write my wife's phone number on there. And my wife is at home, and we have a 4-year-old, we got a 17-month-old, and my wife is 7 months pregnant. And so one of her friends called her on the phone and said, "Hey, Jamie, turn on the TV and look at what just happened." Because there was already a helicopter hovering over the Oklahoma City Federal Building and was putting all of this on display on the TV immediately. It was a new thing for us here in the United States to be able to watch something like that unfold in real time. And so as she turned on the TV and she looked, she saw that my black Ford Ranger was there, and it was completely demolished. And so we had been in the Marine Corps a while, and I had just come back from Desert Storm, where I'd flown 35 combat missions. And so we knew the drill when somebody died in your command. And so one of my candidates, not Bill, Nick Morris, who later became a lieutenant colonel, he came to the house in the uniform, and my wife went out of the house and says, "No, you can't come into this house because I believe my husband is still alive." And so finally, Nick Morris, Colonel Morris, was able to convince my wife that he didn't know anything, so he let her into the building. And later that afternoon, about 4 o'clock that afternoon, I finally came out of surgery, and my wife had a family member there who drove her to Oklahoma City. And I was at St. Anthony's Hospital, which is just a block or two from the building. And as they drove by the building, they could smell the death, because it had rained that afternoon and mixed with the water. It was just a terrible sight. And she goes and she sees the devastations that's there, and she goes into labor. And so as she gets to the hospital, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people waiting in front of the emergency room entrance, and they're holding signs and pictures, and they're saying, "Hey, have you seen my husband? Have you seen my son? Have you seen my daughter?" And all of these people outside of the hospital with no hope, with little hope, because most likely their friends, their family members are there in the rubble of the building. So my wife, she goes in and she says, "My husband is in the ICU here. They said he's not going to make it through the night. I'm here to see my husband." So she gets into the hospital. A nurse comes to her and says, "Honey, you're not going to see your husband. You're going to the maternity ward." And so she goes to the maternity ward, and I always hold this against my daughter, right? Because this was my big day. I had been blown up. I finally got some attention. But no, my daughter, she wanted to take all my attention from me. I don't know why that is, but anyhow, so my wife went into the maternity ward. They were able to stop the labor, and she was able to come and visit me, and obviously I was able to make it through. And so I just have a couple of remarks about this story, and especially for those of us now that we live in a culture that is so different now, right? We live in a cancel culture, right? That if we don't think that somebody believes what we believe, you know, in social media and whatever, we can just turn them off, right? And so I'm here to talk to you about what happened to me and how I can help you in your life as you go forward. Because like I said, what had happened to Timothy McVeigh, and if you've seen, there's a documentary out there called Oklahoma City. It used to be on Netflix, and it's around, but it goes and it talks about how Timothy McVeigh became angry, and he allowed that anger to turn into hate, and that hate turned into a 5,000-pound fertilizer bomb, right? So how do we stop and I'll use a military term, how do we stop the kill chain? Right? How do we stop our anger from turning into hate to turning into violence? And so for me, one of the first things that I learned is that you need to be grateful, right? You need to be thankful every day that you come and that you're here. Because as you saw in my story, your whole life can change in a second. And maybe you have petty grievances against your parents or against a friend, right? And you need to take the time to be thankful for those who love you. You need to tell them that you love them. Because as you grow up and as you go into adulthood, it's always in the back of your mind that you're going to get a call like that, right? That somebody's got cancer, that somebody's been in an accident, that something has happened to them. And if you will be grateful, if you will be thankful, not in the good times, not when it's easy, but be grateful when everything is against you. When you've had a bad grade, you didn't do well on the test, you need to be thankful. When your boyfriend has broken up with you, you need to be thankful. When your parents are on your back, you need to be thankful. Because if you will have a grateful heart, then that is the basis for living a successful life. Now, what happened to us is because I was there and I saw Timothy McVeigh get out of the vehicle, I was the second witness in the Oklahoma City bombing trial because I was able to place McVeigh at the scene. Okay? And so while we were there in the trial there in Denver, my wife was in the jury, not the jury, she was in the seating of the spectators there of the trial, and she was sitting right next to Terry Nichols' mother. Okay? And I don't know if y'all know much about the bombing, but Terry Nichols was the accomplice to Tim McVeigh. And here is this grandmother who had lived a good life, who had done everything she could for her kid, and now here everyone is hurling death threats at her. And my wife is sitting next to her, someone who's done no wrong, but it is under a lot of pressure and is under a lot of hate that is coming from the people that have been wounded and had victims in their lives. And so my second point is, be gracious. All right? Be gracious. Grace, the word grace means an undeserved gift. Right? So when I say be gracious, what I'm saying is that you need to give undeserved gifts to those around you. Right? And part of this is good etiquette. Right? And I was just back in the junior ROTC building back here, and they were doing parade practice and drill, right? And the military has a very strong etiquette, right? Because you have hundreds, if not thousands, of men and women all together, and if there's not an etiquette for how we deal with each other, then everybody would be at each other's throats, right? And so to be gracious is to forgive someone that has maybe they cut in front of line, right? Maybe they did something that you didn't like, right? Be gracious. Because there's another term that when you're gracious, you become this term called meek, right? And meek, the word meek, stands and means controlled power, right? So you see a strong man, I'll just use the Marine Corps. You see Marines and they're armed to the teeth and they're ready to go into combat, but they're controlled and they're disciplined, then that person is meek, right? It doesn't mean that you're weak or that you're being run over. It means that you're powerful and that you've controlled that power. And so the first step in becoming meek, to becoming strong, and being able to control your power, to become a leader, is to be gracious to those who are around you. Okay? Then the last thing that I have to say is forgive. Right? Because as I was in that trial, and I was there sitting across from Tim McVeigh, and I looked into his dark eyes that had no remorse, and that he didn't care a one rip about any of the people that had been killed in that bombing. I came to a point to where I was able to forgive him. Right? And let me explain. Forgiveness means to decouple your anger from the action. Right? So Timothy McVeigh didn't know that I forgave him, but I forgave him because it was good for me. It was good for me to let go of my angry feelings. Because if I held on to my anger and I became bitter and I became resentful, who am I hurting? Myself. That's right. And if I had allowed Timothy McVeigh to make me angry and bitter, I would have been the 169th victim in the Oklahoma City bombing. So I had to forgive him. Not because I was trying to get him out, because there's another word too, remit, right? He had to pay the bill. And as we continue on with this story, 3 years later, after the trial, I went to his execution with the Attorney General of the United States, and we saw him put a needle in his arm, and we saw Timothy McVeigh close his eyes for the last time. And so just because you forgive someone and you decouple your anger from what the hurt that they did from you, doesn't mean that that person is still not going to pay the bill. Right? If your boyfriend cheats on you, you can forgive him, decouple the anger, but he's still going to pay the bill because he's not going to be around you any longer. Right? See how that works? And so that's my encouragement to you through my story, is that you be thankful. Be thankful every day of the wonderful things that the Lord has given you. Be gracious to those who are around you, right? Because we all live together and we all have small faults, and we just need a little bit of oil to make sure that the machinery works well together. So be gracious to those around you. And finally, and I ask from the bottom of my heart, is that you forgive those who have wronged you. Because if you hold on to your anger, and you hold on, and that anger turns to bitterness, then the only person that you're hurting is yourself. And so I'm here to say that even though Timothy McVeigh, I was a pilot, right? And I was blinded in my right eye. So when this happened, my flight career was over. My Marine Corps career was over. And not only did that, but Timothy McVeigh tried to kill me too. And so I can tell you that if I can forgive Timothy McVeigh, that you can forgive those that are around you. And if you can do that, then you will have a successful life. And that's what I want for y'all, is that as you go through high school and you get through to graduation, that you can go on and meet the challenges in life and have a successful life. Thank you all very much.
So we have just a few minutes here. If anyone has any questions for Captain Norfleet, just raise your hand and feel free to ask.
Did you have any time to like process the emotions of all that was going on? Like when you were in that building as it was happening?
Well, you know, Dan, that's a very good question, by the way. So the question is did I have time to process what was going on in the building and how did I feel, right? So I can tell you for myself, when I was in that situation, you know, they call it fight or flight, right? In that when you're in a desperate situation and you're trying to save your life, right? That you really kind of go into an automatic mode, right? And so fortunately, since I have been in combat and been trained a lot, you know, I was able to make the correct decisions without really having to think about it. But the second half to your question is, how do you process the emotions of the trauma and the tragedy? And I'll tell you, I didn't do well at that because, you know, I was a Marine and I was a pilot in the Marine Corps, and I just thought I could do no wrong at the time and that nothing could stop me. And so for the first 5 years after the Oklahoma City bombing, I was trying to prove to everyone that I was okay, right? And that nothing had happened to me and it was just a little bump in the road, right? But it wasn't until 5 years later when I really kind of came to the realization that I had been hurt, right? And that I had been hurt in a bad way. And so it wasn't until I came to the realization that I couldn't do it by myself and that I couldn't fix myself by myself that I was able to open up and get some help and have some people help me. And so, you know, so part of that is a pride thing, right? And so, you know, we didn't talk about humility, but humility to me is one of the key things to finding your way through a tragedy. Because the Oklahoma City bombing, I mean, you know, it's in the history books. We got a national memorial down there. But the only difference between my tragedy and your tragedy, I mean, maybe some of y'all have lost a parent or lost a loved one or have had a car wreck or some kind of tragedy in your life. My tragedy, the only difference is my tragedy was on TV, right? Every one of us will go through some kind of tragedy. We'll lose a grandparent, we'll lose a parent, something will happen in our lives. And we've got to be open enough and humble enough to be able to accept help from those around us, right? Because, you know, for most of us, we have a loving family, we have a loving community, and when we go into a tragedy like that, we need to allow them to help us and not be so prideful that we can't accept help. And so I kind of answered both sides of your question. Any other questions?
Thank you again, Captain Norfleet. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this presentation, and you all can go back to your